Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Bea and the GAP project for putting together this report. It highlights areas of concern of our organization. The Central American Black Organization, let me give you just a little bit of background, is a network of more than 30 organizations of African descendants in Central America. And we encompass 6 countries, from Panama down to up to Belize. And now we are getting membership applications from Mexico, from southern Mexico, and also from some South American countries. The organization is 15 years old and is the only organization that is officially recognized by most governments in Central America. And we just finished our 15th General Assembly in Belize. And these reports were part of the discussion that we had there. And the issues highlighted there are very close to the agenda of the Central American Black Organization, looking at the issues of discrimination, the protection of human rights, and sustainable development for our communities. Those are the areas that we want to concentrate on. And we feel that the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank are key organizations because they are the main funders of development in the region. And as Bea and others were saying, you know, the large number of African descendants in Latin America are likely to be poor. There's some dismal figures, like for example, of 1,000 children born alive, 105 would die before reaching 1 year old in the Afro-descendant communities, as opposed to 39-40 for the rest of the population. So these are great areas of concern for us. For example, the students going out of high school, only 2% can afford to go for higher education. So things like that, we believe that need to be addressed in order for our population to become competitive. And these banks play a great role alongside our governments and our local community-based organizations in addressing these issues. For many years, we've been meeting with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank to discuss these issues at the highest level. We had meetings with President Moreno, with Santiago Levy at the IDB, Keiko Obata, who is the director or chief for the Department of Diversity at the bank. And we've been able to achieve very small, we had some very small achievements along the years. You know, we've been talking for more than 10 years. And we feel that we're received at the organizations, maybe out of courtesy, but not from a strong commitment to address issues. So for us, it's important at this conjunction of moments where this report was produced. The bank is looking at this bank replenishment. There's a re-election coming from the president. So it's a good moment to recommit the bank and also the World Bank to address this situation. And let me read a little bit what was the resolution from our General Assembly, because that's where I want to base our discussion here. The GAP report confirms ONECA's concern about discriminating practices within the IDB and the World Bank. Therefore, the General Assembly issued a mandate to the board to continue the process of analyzing the practices denounced in the GAP reports regarding discrimination that seriously constrain the hiring, promotion, and retention of Afro-descendant and indigenous professionals in the bank's staff, especially at the IDB. Likewise, these same practices result in a virtual exclusion of these communities from the programs and investment projects in the region. In view of these issues, the General Assembly issued a resolution to prepare an action plan to strengthen a mutually beneficial relationship with the bank, committing available human resources from its teams to support the design of proposals led by these institutions to address the needs of our communities in the areas of investment to promote sustainable economic development and capacity building. So the idea is not to move beyond the criticism and start looking and finding ways to work together as partners. you know, as opposed to just receiving us as, you know, friends visiting from Honduras and other places. But as partners that we can produce results working together. And our organizations are committing, you know, we have very limited resources, but we want to address these issues, and we're committing those resources at a sacrifice of volunteers and people who dedicate their time to these issues, so we can work with the banks in achieving results. But we want to move beyond just the conversation and establish clear, measurable goals and try to achieve them. But also we would like to challenge the organizations to look at the possibility of having an alliance with organizations like CABO or others to monitor the achievement of these goals. Because, you know, we can spend our time meeting and discussing, but then if we don't have clear goals and a way of measuring it with accountability to organizations on the ground that are looking at the impact of these projects, we'll not go anywhere. So I believe that these are areas that we need to begin working with in order to actually have something to show, you know, when banks call for the next replenishment, you know, they can say, well, in partnership with the communities, these are the goals that we achieved, and then our next replenishment will be, you know, more effective in those areas. So some of the recommendations that came out of the General Assembly was that the banks should develop policies or strategies to address the issues related to Afro-descendants and indigenous communities in the region. And those strategies should be developed in conjunction with the organizations on the ground. We believe that, and we congratulate the bank on the new initiatives that they are taking, because we don't know about the World Bank, what they're doing at this point. But these initiatives of being more aggressive in recruiting people from Afro-descendants and indigenous groups is very important, and is you know, something that we'll continue working with. However, there's still some things at the interior of this organization that needs to be addressed, because I remember in the very successful diversity conference that was organized in November, there was a comment from very high officials, you know, the president of the bank and somebody at the second level there, more or less said something like this, you know, the diversity that we were kind of proposing at the time would compromise the quality of the services of the bank. And that was very hard to swallow for most of the organizations that were participating in that conference. So I believe that we need to address those issues from within and start a discussion inside the organization with participation of organizations like this who are participating here today to address these issues, because inside the organization have to develop the awareness and sensitivity to address these issues. Otherwise, you know, it'll be only talk and then, you know, it will be just a self-serving discourse and not achieving any result. Regarding the country strategies, I believe this is something that is very close to the heart of our organization, because we believe that it's basically the only way where investment in our communities can become, you know, like mainstream inside the bank, as opposed to just depending on small projects from trust funds. So this is a great achievement that we'll continue to work closely and to follow up and see where we can go with the bank. So I would repeat just that the Central American Black Organization is committed to these issues and is working with the bank, with the Inter-American Development Bank. We also had meetings with the World Bank last year, and there will be another delegation here in February this year to try to pursue a stronger relationship with these banks and making sure that we participate with them in addressing the issues of our communities. So we're open to work with them and with any other organization, because these objectives are larger than ourselves. Thank you.
their seats?
There are 3 open seats in the room for those of you standing in the doorway. There's one right here, and there's one right there, and there's one back there with a briefcase, and there's another one here. Okay, a couple of people can find seats. We're going to move on.
There's still
Vince McElhinny.
here. There's still 1 or 2 seats over here.
There are a couple of seats over here.
There's 2 seats over there. Okay.
Vince McElhinny from the Bank Information Center is going to say a few words next. Vince has been working for many years monitoring the activities of the Inter-American Development Bank and has specialized in issues of sustainable development. So, Vince.
Good evening, everybody. And let me just start by making the beginning of a few brief points to congratulate GAP and Bea and Shelley in particular on a really timely and important study, and by all indications of the comments that have been made by the IDB so far has had some influence in some of the decisions that they're contemplating in the context of the recapitalization proposal. And I think I'll underscore again, if not to repeat, that this is a timely study because of the importance, the magnitude of the moment, which is that the bank has asked its donor countries to replenish its capital on the order of $180 billion. And the U.S. Treasury owns 30% of the stock of IDB capital. And so the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Congress will have to decide whether it's going to give that part of the money, 30% of what has been requested. And historically, these have been the only moments in which the IDB actually really changes its behavior. The last one was 15 years ago. These happen once a generation, so we don't have many times, many moments, or many opportunities to really get the bank to change its ways. One of those moments is right now, and that's why the report is so important, because it speaks to some of the core challenges that the bank has faced historically. I also want to say that as a representative or speaking on behalf of the U.S. Treasury for the moment, because this is one of our avenues for influence, we're speaking on behalf or in the name of a country who has seen inequality go through the roof in the last 10 years. And we're actually analyzing data that show in the last 18 months, as a consequence of the financial crisis, inequality has increased even more. And so every day we have, as the United States, have less credibility than ever to be telling anyone how to solve inequality. And so in recognition of that issue, of that challenge, I'll nevertheless suggest ways in which perhaps the bank itself has recognized its limitations of being able to do or follow through in part in some of the things that Andrew and Tina were talking about. The bank recently published an evaluation of basically all of the efforts it's made since the 1994 replenishment to fulfill some of the principles of that agreement, including promotion of social equity, which was one of the pillars of getting $40 billion 15 years ago. And the study is like a greatest hits of all the evaluations that the evaluation department has done over the last 15 years. And some of the sort of subtitles speak volumes about just the sobering incapacity of this bank to do anything beyond really lip service to actually address the problems of inequality in Latin America. Things like less talk, more targets. The bank doesn't set targets for itself. And that's one of the reasons why, after 15 years of having a mandate to promote social equity, it still doesn't even know in its own bank how many people of different races and classes work there, much less in the region. I mean, I find it interesting that we'll now go back to the household surveys and try to harmonize the standards for being able to count those in country. That was an initiative 10 years ago. It was abandoned by the bank about 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, it's important to come back to these because they were good ideas that should have never been abandoned. And that's one of the reasons why we can't say anything systematic about inequality in Latin America, is because it wasn't important enough to measure. Less talk, more targets. Another important insight made by the bank is, are you going to have standards when you enter into a dialogue with your clients? Are you going to have non-negotiable standards? Or is the client going to dictate what it wants from you? And that's become a very gray area for us. We're heartened to hear that there's going to be a renewed interest in looking at inequality. But historically, the bank and the evidence in the region has shown that stable and increasing indices of inequality in the region have occurred in spite of the fact that the IDB has increased lending to almost all of its clients. So there is no apparent causal association between lending more and being able to reduce inequality, because it hasn't happened empirically. And one of the reasons it hasn't happened is because the IDB has been too timid to actually encourage and ultimately force its clients to lend for the types of projects that get at the mechanisms that reproduce inequality in those countries. They work at the margins. It's indicative by the low level, and we can debate whether it's 2% or 5% of lending volume, but you're not even in the ballpark. Okay, this is the #1 obstacle to development in Latin America. You know, a commission of right-wing economists produced a report to justify the replenishment that was presented in McElhinny. And the single most important factor that they pointed to, Michel Camdesu, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, I mean, these are not people who come from the left-wing fringe. The #1 obstacle is inequality. So what are we going to do? I mean, are we going to devote a new report every 2 years? Are we going to move the margin of effort from 2% to maybe 3 or 4% of the volume? What I would like to hear from the bank prior to getting any money from our government or any of the other donor governments is a program that lasts 10 to 20 years, that has targets that are going to result, if you don't meet them, in someone losing their job at the vice presidential level or in similar managerial level. Unless we have that level of accountability and we can bank on that before we write the check, this is going to be what is described very eloquently in what has become a ritual. Every 5 years we're going to write a compelling report that diagnoses and describes to death things we all know. That inequality is reproduced over and over again, and the bank does a very good job at describing it, but can never bring itself to actually doing something about it. And so while we welcome as friends the interventions that were made on behalf of the IDB so far, we stand in light of this very sobering evidence of the incapacity to do anything in the past, and therefore very skeptical. And so I'll end my comments with that. Thank
you. And our next speaker is Joia Nuri. She's the Chief of Staff for TransAfrica Forum. It is the oldest and largest African-American human rights and social justice advocacy organization promoting diversity and equity in the foreign policy arena.
Can you hear me if I stand up, or should I sit down?
Whenever you're
I'll stand up. I could not have said it better. I could not have said it better like you were in my head. And with all due respects to my comrades from the bank and IDB, I could not have said it better. I want to start with a joke that Woody Allen's told about 30 years ago, just to divert this conversation just for a little bit. There were two women who were eating, and they were in a diner and they were eating their lunch, and one of the women said, "Oh my God, this food is horrible. This food's gonna make me sick. This food is the worst I've ever eaten. This is terrible." And the woman next to her said, "You're absolutely right. It's terrible. And there isn't enough of it." For all of the blessings that the World Bank brings, it brings a lot of things that are not blessings. And as we sit and argue about whether or not it should be 2% or 5% or 10%, of some of the things that African nations and nations around the world have had to give up in order to get this desperate loan from the World Bank or IDB, just isn't fair. And as we're arguing and talking back and forth about this wonderful report by GAP, which we really do thank you for, we have to understand that sometimes getting these loans is not the panacea that we think they ought to be. Structural adjustments, subsidies given to other countries, countries being told what they can and cannot do in order to get a loan from the richest nations in the world has to be looked at also. Sometimes getting a World Bank loan or an IDB loan is not what it should be for your country. So that's separate from what we're talking about today, but I just could not go forward in this conversation without talking about sometimes the bigger picture and the other issues of discrimination. Yes, indeed, 40% of the population in Latin America is African descendant or indigenous. And 2% of loans there is not just because the GAP's report didn't come out soon enough. There are structural problems within these IFIs that make that possible. I refuse to believe it's an accident. And I'm not saying that we're going to blame the individuals who work for these organizations, not at all. But there's a systematic problem that is working at full steam and with efficiency for this level of discrimination to be true. And we can make recommendations and we can move forward, and we should do that, and we should have targets, and we should do that. But the problem here is not going to be fixed by this report or a list of targets or everybody at the bank deciding to confess that they're Afro-Brazilian. There is something systematically wrong with an organization run by the richest organizations in the world, nations in the world, that can come back with numbers like this. It is not by accident. So that's my position. And I also want to say, I loved your story about raise your hand for discrimination. But for me, when you looked around for the people who were discriminated against in their lives, in their jobs, and then you looked at the people who actually had the nerve to complain, it only proved to me that the fear of complaining is worse than the punishment you're getting by being discriminated against. And sometimes the fear of speaking up makes you want to just take the abuse. And each and every day we don't stand up and stop it, either in the bank or at IBD, International, I'm getting nervous. Yes, Development Bank. We say yes to it. We say yes to it as humans. We say yes to it as Africans. We say yes to it as women. We say yes to it as men. We say yes. So this systematic problem is not an accident at the bank. It's not an accident in Jim Crow. It's not an accident in any level of discrimination. It's working at full steam and with great efficiency. Thank you.